You walk slowly, your footsteps softened by dust that has gathered through countless years, and the air is close here beneath the earth, heavy with the mingled scents of damp stone and faint smoke drifting from the single lantern you carry. The flame trembles when you move, its golden circle of light expanding and retreating like breath itself. The shadows stretching along the walls in shapes that seem alive, as though the carved stones remember the people who once stood in this hidden place. You feel the coolness of the passage pressing close to your skin, the air dense with the hush of things left unsaid. And somewhere behind you, the world above goes on with its noise and daylight, yet it feels impossibly far from here. The lantern's warmth does little against the deep chill radiating from the stone around you, but you keep it near, watching its glow tremble across rough walls cut by hands long gone, as if carrying this light makes you part of the memory itself. You imagine those first believers descending these same steps in silence, their sandals whispering against rock, the smell of oil lamps mingling with sweat and earth, each face lit by hope that burned quieter yet stronger than any flame they carried. The air must have felt the same to them, you think, close and breathless, yet sheltering, as though the world above, with its bright marketplaces and loud voices, had been set aside, replaced by this secret refuge carved beneath the feet of emperors. Your steps bring you deeper until the walls widen into a chamber, and the darkness bends away from the small circle of light you hold, revealing low ceilings crusted with soot, benches worn smooth by bodies that once gathered in the hush of prayer. The room smells of ancient oil and the faint trace of something mineral in the stones, cool and almost metallic. And as you breathe it in, you feel as though you have stepped not into a place, but into a memory waiting in the dark. You picture them here, huddled close, their faces weary from work above ground, the dust of streets still clinging to their robes, voices lowered, not only from fear of discovery, but from the deep reverence that comes when hope survives in secret places. The lantern light bends across carvings cut into the walls, symbols simple yet certain, fish and shepherds and winding vines, the marks of hands that wanted to leave behind something that spoke when they could not, something that might outlast them all. You run your fingers across one shallow carving, the stone rough beneath your touch, and the thought comes softly that whoever shaped it likely never imagined a time centuries later when strangers might stand here tracing the same worn lines in silence. The air grows cooler as you step farther in, the lantern warming only your hands now, and you feel the strangeness of time folding close, as though every prayer ever whispered here had lingered in the dust instead of rising upward to vanish. You imagine the sound of them, voices blending softly under the low ceiling, words carrying more yearning than certainty, people whose faith had no buildings or statues yet, only gatherings in places like this, where the darkness made every word feel louder. The room seems to hold its breath even now, the silence layered so thick you can almost hear the memory of feet scuffing the floor, the rustle of robes as someone knelt, the quiet gasp as a flame caught in a newly trimmed lamp. The walls would have felt cool then too, the air tinged with the smell of olive oil burning in shallow clay dishes, smoke curling upward to stain the stone, the prayers rising slower, held close by the heavy air and the weight of secrecy. You imagine children here too, shifting restlessly against tired parents, their small faces made solemn by the dimness. The strange adventure of meeting in a place where the grown-ups spoke in whispers, the flicker of flames painting gentle light across wide eyes. Somewhere in the corner of this imagined gathering you see someone holding a small scroll, the parchment edges curled from use, their voice trembling as they read words copied by hand, each line carrying across the silence like something precious carried across water. The listeners would have leaned close, not wanting to miss a syllable. The words about kindness and forgiveness and love spoken softly enough to keep from echoing, yet with a strength that made every heart here beat as though hearing fire itself breathe. You walk slowly past the benches toward the far wall, where niches cut into the stone hold fragments of clay jars, and you wonder what they carried, perhaps oil for lamps, or bread for the breaking, or letters smuggled across provinces to bring courage here. The lantern light touches everything gently as you move, and you feel the roughness of the walls when your shoulder brushes them, the uneven floor beneath your sandals, the closeness of air that has not changed in centuries except for the visitors who come. You pause where the room narrows into another passage, the darkness curling tight like a held breath, and you feel the weight of the earth above, pressing down, not threatening, but sheltering, as though the whole world has wrapped this place in its arms. The flame in your lantern wavers when you step into the narrower hall, its glow trembling across paintings so faint they seem more imagined than real, colors rubbed thin by time until only traces of ochre and brown whisper of hands long gone. Here, a figure of a shepherd bends beneath centuries of dust, the painted lines fragile yet stubborn, and you think about the people who must have stood here once, tilting the same way you do now, trying to see hope in fading colors. The air tastes faintly of ash this far in, though no fire burns now, and the coolness deepens until your breath comes out pale in the light, mingling with the thin smoke of the lantern, as though time itself exhaled slowly around you. Somewhere water drips, the sound sharp yet distant, falling from the ceiling to gather in shallow pools that glint when your light passes. Tiny mirrors set into the stone as though the earth itself wanted to keep the memory of flickering flames. You wonder how many feet have passed this way, how many careful steps traced these same turns with lamps held close, how many hearts beat faster, not from fear, but from the strange courage that comes when faith survives in the quietest corners. The passage turns once more before opening into another chamber, smaller than the first, where the ceiling lowers enough that you bow your head without thinking. The air here so cold, your hands ache even through the faint heat of the lantern handle. On the floor, someone long ago scratched a circle with a cross inside it. The lines faint yet still clear under dust, and you kneel without meaning to, your fingers tracing the marks as though touching them might let you feel the hand that made them. The stillness gathers thicker here, the lantern flame bending lower as its oil thins, and you realize the people who came before would have ended their gatherings with the same dwindling light. Walking back toward the steps before the lamps went out entirely, you imagine the sound of them leaving, the soft shuffle of many feet, the final murmurs of voices fading upward toward air that smelled of night and open sky, their lives waiting above while their faith stayed rooted here like warmth left in ashes. You stand slowly, the ache in your knees rising with you, and hold the lantern higher toward the ceiling where soot blooms like dark flowers, each layer left by some long-vanished flame that once lit faces now gone quiet into history. When you turn back toward the way you came, the passage feels narrower, as though the walls have leaned closer to listen, and your own footsteps echo softly behind you, the only sound in a place that has carried so many whispered prayers before. The air grows warmer as you climb toward the faint promise of daylight. The lantern still glowing, though faintly now, its circle of light shrinking across the stone like a memory closing slowly as the present world waits above for your return. And as you reach the last turn where the stairs begin to rise, you glance back once toward the deep hush behind you, feeling as though you have borrowed something fragile from this place, some quiet faith that burns softer yet longer than fire itself. The day begins slowly, with sunlight sliding down tiled rooftops into narrow streets where the dust stirs beneath sandals and wheels, and you walk there among the voices and smells and heat, moving through the heart of the city, as though passing through a dream you only half remember. The air carries the warmth of bread pulled from ovens at dawn, mingling with the sharper scents of olives brined in clay jars, figs spilling sweetness from woven baskets, smoke rising from small braziers where vendors roast fish over glowing coals that crackle softly beneath the voices of bargaining men. You feel the heat pressing against your shoulders, the early sun pooling like molten bronze upon the stones, the weight of so many footsteps drumming through the dust, while sellers call out their prices and women lean close to test the ripeness of pears with slow, practiced hands. The market is never silent, not truly, yet within its layered voices you notice the smaller sounds too, the hum of bees hovering near dates dripping sugar, the distant bleat of a goat tethered beside a stall of herbs, the swish of cloth as someone brushes past. You move through it all carefully, as though not to disturb the rhythm, and the warmth wraps you like a heavy cloak, while the air bends with spices, cinnamon and cumin drifting between stalls, until each breath carries a taste of far-off hillsides baked in sunlight. Somewhere among this clamor, the first believers once passed as you do now, their faces unremarkable, their robes dusty like everyone else's, their eyes lowered yet watchful, carrying the quiet weight of words that could not be spoken aloud beneath so many listening strangers. You imagine them pausing beside the basket sellers, their hands testing pomegranates for bruises, voices casual as they asked the price. Yet, in the slow glance between them, some faint sign passed, a shift of fingers, a tilt of the wrist, something no one else would notice. For those who knew, a line traced lightly in dust with the toe of a sandal meant more than idle gesture. The curve of a fish drawn so quickly it might vanish before anyone saw, yet it marked faith hiding beneath the noise like cool water under stone. You see one now in memory, a woman carrying a jar against her hip, moving slowly past a row of figs, pausing just long enough to leave a small, wrapped bundle beside the basket of another woman who nods without looking up, both faces steady as stone. Inside that bundle might be a scrap of parchment bearing words copied by hand under lamplight, or perhaps only bread offered toward some household waiting on the city's edge. The act itself, speaking louder than anything that could be said here, under so many watching eyes. The heat gathers heavier as noon leans closer, the air shimmering above flat rooftops where laundry stiffens in sunlight. Yet, in the shadow of the colonnade, the believers pause near the well, their voices low enough to disappear beneath the echo of dipping buckets. You stand there too, feeling the cool drift from the water below, the smell of wet clay rising as ropes creak and pulleys groan, and one man bends to drink while another traces his finger idly through the dust beside his heel, half a curve left unfinished. No one else sees the shape form slowly, completed only when a second man kneels to tie his sandal beside it, drawing the other half with a quick motion hidden beneath his hand. A fish now resting there where moments ago was only dust. The marketplace swallows it quickly as they stand again, feet scuffing over lines until nothing remains. Yet in the glance they share you sense something steady, like fire covered carefully beneath ash, so it will burn through the night after everyone has gone. A seller's voice rises above the crowd, sharp with impatience, calling out the price of grain. Yet even that fades beneath the clatter of wheels rolling past, a donkey braying somewhere near the gate, and the low chant of a beggar lifting his bowl toward strangers' hands. You notice how ordinary it all feels, how easily faith can move like breath through such places without drawing a single curious look. Each believer passing coins for bread or dates or dried fish, speaking softly about weather while carrying other words unspoken within them. The sun climbs until the awnings sag with heat, dye bleeding slowly from faded cloth that smells of dust and wind. Yet beneath their shade a boy sells small oil lamps molded from clay, his fingers blackened where smoke has licked them night after night. One buyer pauses longer than needed, turning a lamp slowly in his hands before setting it back, his fingertip leaving the faintest mark in the ash dusting its side. Nothing anyone else would notice, yet the seller watches with a nod too small for strangers' eyes. Such signs move like minnows through clear water, quick and nearly invisible, carrying messages no louder than breath, yet binding people across streets and stairways and doorways until the whole city hums with words, almost spoken but never heard by those who would not understand. You wander farther where the smell of honey cakes thickens the air, golden rounds cooling on boards beside a woman fanning flies away. And you picture someone slipping a coin beneath one cake before lifting it into a basket, the seller watching without change in her face. Perhaps when the basket reaches its destination, the cake will be broken in half so more can eat. Perhaps the coin will pay for oil to keep lamps burning longer during prayers whispered after nightfall. Perhaps no one will speak of it at all. The marketplace bends slowly toward evening, the heat easing as shadows lengthen between columns and voices soften, and you feel the day settling like dust across shoulders, across jars now empty of milk, across stones still warm where children draw shapes with blunt chalk. Somewhere near the steps of the bathhouse, two men pause beside a cart of apricots, heads bent as though weighing fruit, yet the words passing between them name a place and an hour when others will gather, their voices steady as though speaking only of weather. You watch the cart owner slice a bruised apricot for tasting juice, spilling over his knife onto the stones, the air sweet around him. And no one here notices anything beyond the business of hunger and trade and the slow cooling of another long day. The believers slip through it all like threads through cloth, binding corners that never meet, their messages carried in gestures and fragments, in glances and coins left behind, in baskets traded and letters hidden inside sacks of grain headed toward villages beyond the walls. The smell of evening fires begins drifting over rooftops where women stir pots with long wooden spoons, the smoke mixing with dust until the whole city tastes of ash and cumin and something faintly metallic rising from the river as the wind turns westward. You find yourself near the gate, where vendors pack baskets with unsold figs, their voices tired now, slower, as though even words have grown heavy after a day beneath so much heat, and you feel the weight of quiet things carried home behind shuttered doors. Somewhere lamps begin to bloom along narrow alleys, the oil burning pale gold against walls streaked by years of smoke. And behind one such door someone will read aloud tonight by this light, the words carried here piece by piece through markets where no one listened closely. You leave as the sky lowers toward dusk, the stones cooling beneath your feet, the air turning soft enough to carry smells of bread and dust and river water together. And behind you, the marketplace sinks slowly into shadow like a tired animal folding itself to rest. And as you walk away, you think of the signs left in dust, the glances traded beside wells, the words smuggled between baskets and jars, the way faith moved here like wind, unseen yet everywhere, gentle yet carrying everything forward into the night beyond. You rise before dawn while the streets still sleep beneath the weight of darkness, and the air carries the faint smell of ashes from last night's fires, mingling with the sharper scent of rising yeast drifting through the cool hush before morning. The bakery waits with its low ceiling stained by smoke, its walls sweating faint warmth into the chill. And as you push the door open, the breath of heat greets you like a living thing, curling round your shoulders with the promise of bread not yet born. Inside, the ovens glow faintly in the gloom, clay mouths exhaling threads of smoke into the half-light, while the baker moves slowly through his motions with the familiarity of someone who has risen this early every day for longer than memory recalls. His hands work silently over the dough, fingers pressing and folding with a rhythm both patient and certain, the air thick with the mingled scents of flour and wood smoke, the glow of embers casting his face in the same warm hue as the loaves waiting to rise. You watch the way his palms leave faint prints across the smooth surface, flour drifting upward like pale breath with each movement. The room quiet except for the creak of the kneading board and the soft thump as dough meets wood again and again. Outside, the streets still lie in darkness, stones cold beneath the night's hand. Yet, here inside, warmth thickens like honey, clinging to your skin, wrapping your breath in steam as the first loaves take shape beneath the steady strength of the baker's work. He speaks little, this man, though sometimes a word passes between him and the boy who carries water jars from the well, their voices low, as though, even in the safety of firelight, there are things better kept soft against listening walls. When others come, slipping quietly through the narrow doorway, they greet one another with nods instead of speech, the smell of baking bread thickening around them until it fills every corner, until it seeps into hair and clothing like a memory that will not leave. You notice how they move easily around one another, each task flowing into the next, the grinding of grain into flour, the stirring of leaven into water, the shaping of loaves lined neatly on wooden boards before disappearing into the oven's waiting heat. Some bring bundles of dried figs or small jars of oil, others carry only empty hands ready to help, and together they work while the sky beyond the door begins to pale, the first birdsong threading softly through the smoky air like a blessing. The boy sets a jug near the hearth where warmth will soften the water's chill, and you see in the shifting firelight the way his eyes catch on the basket in the corner where the first baked loaves cool beneath folded linen. They will not be sold here, not these first ones. Though the bakery feeds the city by daylight, with coins exchanged and prices called aloud. For these loaves belong elsewhere, to hands waiting in doorways, where words cannot be spoken easily beneath curious ears. The baker never writes down the names, yet he knows each one, shaping bread by habit until the dough carries not only yeast but quiet purpose, until the weight of each round loaf seems heavy with more than flour and salt and water drawn from the well. You watch as he draws one loaf from the oven, the crust splitting where heat has kissed it golden, the smell rising warm enough to soften the chill clinging still to the corners of the room, to the sleeves of those standing silently nearby. The linen wraps each loaf before it leaves the bakery, the cloth warm against calloused hands, the basket filled slowly until it seems to glow with its own heat, carrying both food and the hush of something offered toward lives beyond these walls. Sometimes the baker lifts his eyes toward the door when footsteps pass outside, shadows against the thin morning light, and for a moment you see in his face the quiet weight he carries, though his hands never slow across the flour-dusted board before him. The boy brings more wood for the fire, the bark damp so it smolders before catching, the smoke curling upward to kiss the ceiling, where soot blooms like dark flowers, where years of flame have left their memory in blackened petals spreading slowly overhead. Another man enters near dawn, carrying a small sack of dates, his robe damp with river mist, and without words he sets the fruit near the loaves, cooling on the board. The sweetness meant for the evening meal that will follow prayers whispered in a borrowed room. You feel the warmth deepen as the sun finally reaches the doorway. A pale blade of light sliding across the floor to catch in flour dust, hanging like gold above the kneading table, each particle spinning slowly in air heavy with heat and baking bread. The baker moves among it all, like someone tending both fire and faith together, his arms dusted white to the elbows, the smell of yeast clinging to his hair, the muscles of his forearms tightening each time he folds the dough into itself before setting it aside. You sense he has done this through seasons of rain and drought, through winters when flour thinned beneath rationed hands, through summers when the ovens burned hotter than the air outside. His work, a kind of prayer kneaded into crusts, breaking beneath countless teeth. The baskets fill steadily, linen-wrapped loaves stacked like warm stones beside the wall. And soon someone will carry them into streets brightening now, with merchants calling prices, with donkey carts creaking toward the gates, with soldiers marching dust into the day's first heat. No one will look twice at bread carried across the city, where hunger opens doors more quickly than any secret sign might, where children will follow at the smell alone, where soldiers themselves stop to buy crusts for coins rubbed smooth by 100 trades. Yet behind one door after another, these loaves will be broken by hands gathering quietly after sundown, the crumbs falling across words spoken softly enough to vanish beneath crickets singing in courtyards, beneath the rattle of wind-stirring fig leaves above narrow alleys. You picture those rooms as you stand in the bakery's warmth, walls dimly lit by one trembling lamp, faces bending over bread that tastes of wood smoke and work, of water carried before dawn, of silence kept carefully between market stalls and guarded thresholds. Perhaps the baker never sees those faces, never hears the prayers rising after the meal, yet each morning he works as though he does, shaping crust and crumb around a faith that travels farther than his own tired feet will ever carry him. The fire sinks lower as the baskets leave one by one, carried beneath plain linen across streets now bright with sunlight striking stone. The air outside buzzing with merchants and cattle and children chasing each other through dust rising like smoke from the earth itself. You remain until only embers glow in the oven's throats. The day's business beginning now with coins and customers and the ordinary hunger of a city stirring fully awake, while the memory of those first loaves lingers like warmth trapped in cooling brick. When you finally step outside, the air feels sharper, the sun already high above rooftops, tiled red and brown, and behind you the bakery door closes softly, holding inside it the faint smell of yeast and ash, and something quieter than either, something like prayer. And as you walk away, you carry the warmth of it with you, the sense of bread rising slowly in firelight before dawn, of hands shaping more than food in the hush before voices return, of faith carried across a city in the simplest gift of all. You remember the way the road shimmered beneath the late morning sun, dust rising beneath each step, until it seemed you walked not on earth, but through the breath of the sky itself, the air thick with warmth and distance and quiet purpose. The path curved between olive groves, whose leaves clattered softly in the wind, like small coins shaken together, their silver-green undersides flashing beneath a sky too bright to look at for long. And somewhere cicadas sang from dry grass, lining the ditches on either side. You carried the letter close to your chest, where the cloth of your robe held it flat against your skin, its thin parchment warmed by your own body heat, the wax seal pressed firm enough that the words within felt guarded by more than silence alone. The road smelled of dust and sun-baked stone, of wild thyme crushed beneath the hooves of passing donkeys, of river water evaporating in shallow pools, where cattle had stopped to drink before the heat drove them toward shade, gathering under scattered trees. You thought often about the one who had written the letter, how the ink must have glistened wetly beneath lamplight, while the hand moved carefully across the page, each curve of each word carrying weight beyond its size, as though the letters themselves prayed while forming. Perhaps they paused between lines, listening to night insects droning beyond the walls, dipping the reed again into the small clay pot of ink, breath slow enough to keep the letters steady, even while the heart behind them must have beat faster than the hand revealed. The road rose gently, where wind swept dust into shallow waves across the stones, and you felt the sun gathering heavier on your shoulders, the heat turning each breath thick as though the world wanted you to taste its dryness before giving you air again. You wondered whether the ones waiting beyond the hills would recognize the handwriting before the seal was even broken, whether they would hear the voice of the writer rising from each line like something living, like wind passing softly through the hollow of a flute. The path narrowed where the hills pressed closer, the smell of crushed sage rising with each step. The air cooler now where shadows pooled between slopes, and you walked through their shelter with the sense of eyes watching though you knew only birds perched above. At a stream you paused to kneel where water slipped thin and quick over round stones, the surface trembling sunlight into your hands as you drank, the letter beside you on a dry rock where the breeze lifted its corners like fingers testing the edge of a page. You thought of rain then, of how even a sudden storm might blur the ink beyond reading, the words vanishing into nothing but dark streaks across pale parchment, and you felt the weight of sky above, as though weather itself might hold its breath until you passed. The letter carried news yes, but also courage, shaped into sentences. Blessings traced carefully between greetings, the kind of words spoken aloud only behind doors barred against listening ears. Words carried now across hills by feet, scuffing dust into the long, wandering wind. When the road widened again, you walked beside vineyards, where nets stretched above ripening clusters to keep the birds away, their shadows weaving across the ground like thin ropes, and the smell of the fruit hung heavy even in the dry heat of midnight. You imagined the letter arriving, the wax seal cracked open by hands calloused from harvest work, the words read slowly by lamplight while others leaned close to hear each phrase, their faces softening at lines about endurance, about hope arriving like rain after hard seasons. The miles folded beneath your sandals until villages appeared like pale shells scattered across hillsides. Goats moving along walls stacked from stone, dragged here by ancestors whose names had vanished though their work remained, each rock holding sun warmth deep inside its unmoving skin. Children called to one another in narrow lanes where cooking fires smoked beneath clay chimneys, the smell of lentils and garlic drifting into air already thick with dust, and the faint sweetness of figs drying on rooftops, where shadows pooled beneath baskets turned upside down. You kept walking, though your shoulders ached beneath the weight of heat, the letter still uncreased against your chest, and in your mind you pictured the writer sealing it carefully, pressing the ring into softened wax, before lifting the page as though releasing something winged. By the time the path bent toward evening, you had crossed 3 ridges, where the wind smelled of pine sap and stone warmed all day, then slowly cooling, the air shifting toward night chill, even while the earth below your feet still breathed stored heat upward. The village waited beyond the last rise, its lamps beginning to glow like fallen stars against walls washed pale by moonlight. And you walked slower now, as though the letter itself asked for a careful arrival after so many miles of sun and dust and silence. A woman met you near the well where rope creaked against wood as she drew water, her eyes lowering briefly toward the edge of parchment peeking from your robe before she nodded toward a doorway where lamplight breathed faintly against the gathering dark. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and bread cooled hours ago, of oil warming in small clay dishes, of tired bodies carrying the day's labor in the way, shoulders bent and voices fell low, even while faces lifted at the sight of what you carried. The letter left your hands slowly, set upon the table beside figs, wrinkled by sun and a jug of water, sweating coolness in the lamplight. And those gathered leaned closer, as though the page itself breathed, before anyone even touched the seal to break it. You stepped back then, the journey loosening from your body, while the first words lifted into the room. Read carefully by a man whose voice thickened when he reached the lines, speaking of courage, of prayers shared though distance stretched like wilderness between those writing and receiving. The listeners bent forward, eyes catching lamplight each time the reader paused, the silence holding the shape of sentences even after his voice moved on, as though the room itself memorized the words before they vanished into the air above tired heads. Outside, night folded across the hills with the smell of cooling dust, with the chirring of insects rising from dry grass, with the faint sound of water still slipping through the well rope where someone had left the bucket leaning against its stone lip. When the last line left the reader's mouth, the room held stillness thicker than before. A hush carrying warmth through shadows stretching along the walls where lamplight trembled. against plaster rough from years of smoke and weather, and hands leaning as people came and went. Someone rolled the letter carefully when the words were finished, as though its creases might still carry the voice that had written it, as though the ink itself had not yet dried, even after so many miles of sun between one door and another. You watched them set it near the lamp, where its edges curled faintly from heat, where anyone might read it again tomorrow or the next day, until the parchment softened beneath fingers tracing each line, like roads returning them always to the same quiet place. When you finally stepped back into the night, the air felt cooler against your face, the sky deep enough to hold every star without crowding, and behind you the door closed softly, the letter's words now living inside walls where faith kept its own weather. And as you walked away toward the hills again, you thought of the dust rising behind your feet, of the miles already folded into darkness, of the way letters carry not only sentences across distance, but the warmth of one heart reaching toward another. You remember the night when the desert wind slipped through the narrow street like a secret messenger, carrying with it the faint smell of olives and dust and smoke from distant fires, where travelers had warmed themselves beneath the slow stars. There had been talk all day among the believers about a letter, one written by trembling hands in some far-off place where the sea broke endlessly against jagged cliffs. A letter whispered to contain words that could steady the shaking hearts of the faithful. You were there in the little house on the edge of the city, the one with walls baked hard by sun and time. The air inside, thick with the perfume of crushed herbs burning in a shallow dish near the door. The room had been dim except for the faint glow of one crooked lamp, its light trembling across tired faces gathered close together, shadows clinging to the corners like silent witnesses holding their breath. Someone had brought bread from the market, still warm beneath its rough crust, and the fragrance mingled with the smoke so that the room smelled of hunger and comfort and the unspoken hope of people who owned little but shared everything. You sat on the floor near the wall, your fingers tracing the cracks in the clay, as though the earth itself might remember this night when the letter came and the world, for a moment, felt both small and infinite. When the messenger finally arrived, his cloak heavy with sand and the weight of many miles, he carried no gold, no weapons, no treasures, only a thin roll of parchment tied with fraying cord and stained by wind and travel. The elder of the gathering took it gently, his hands roughened by work yet trembling as though he held something alive, something breathing words that could cross oceans and deserts and the narrowness of human fear. You remember the way the silence deepened as he unrolled it slowly, the parchment crackling softly like the first stirrings of a fire, the lamp flame leaning toward the sound as though eager to hear. The words, when he began to read, were steady and warm, written by someone who had seen suffering and yet spoke of joy like a secret garden hidden behind the walls of the world. You could almost taste the salt of distant seas in his voice, could almost hear the cry of gulls and the groan of ship timbers carrying this letter across waters where moonlight trembled like silver breath. The sentences spoke of faith as something quiet yet unshaken, like roots drinking deep beneath winter soil, unseen yet waiting with patient strength for the green of spring no empire could prevent from rising. They spoke of love as though it were a fire no storm could drown, a light the wind could bend but never break, a warmth passed hand to hand in the darkness until every shadow learned its own small surrender. You remember how the faces around you softened as the words went on, how even the weary seemed to breathe more slowly, as though the letter had opened a window in the heavy air of the room. Outside, the wind moved through the streets with the sound of sand against stone, carrying away the faint echoes of children's laughter, the bark of a dog, the far-off creak of a cart rolling toward the edge of sleep. The elder's voice grew quieter near the end, the words gathering like birds before flight, speaking of endurance, of prayer rising like incense toward a sky both silent and listening, of a kingdom not built by human hands. When the reading was done, the letter lay across his knees like something fragile, yet unafraid. And for a long moment no one moved, as though motion itself might scatter the peace it had left behind. You remember the warmth of the bread when it was finally broken and passed around, the crust rough against your fingers, the taste carrying both the dust of the day and the sweetness of grain ripened beneath an untamed sun. Someone poured oil into a shallow dish, and its fragrance lifted softly, mingling with the quiet, so that even the air felt anointed by the words still drifting like embers through every listening heart. You recall how prayers rose afterward, not in haste, but slowly, like water filling the deep places of the earth, each voice carrying thanks, as though speaking not to the ceiling above, but to a presence surrounding everything. The lamp burned lower, yet no one hurried to leave, as though the night itself had leaned close to listen, its stars holding their distance with a patience older than walls or roads or empires. Later, when the gathering finally ended, you stepped outside into streets washed pale by moonlight, the wind cool against your face, carrying the faint trace of smoke and bread and something else you could not name. You carried the words with you long after the letter was folded away, long after the house grew dark, long after footsteps faded into the hush that comes before dawn remembers itself again. Even now, when you close your eyes, you can hear them, those sentences carried across earth and sea and hunger, words written by someone you never met yet somehow knew, because faith speaks in a language older than distance. The wind has changed since that night, carrying other scents, other voices, other letters written and lost and found again. Yet you sometimes wonder if its song still holds the faint echo of those early words. Perhaps somewhere in the corners of the world where silence lingers like dust, there are still letters waiting to be read aloud beneath a single crooked lamp in a house filled with bread and hope and trembling hands. And perhaps the wind, which remembers more than any of us, will carry them too, through streets and centuries and lives we will never see, until every weary room has known the warmth of their passing. You remember the way the path to the old quarry twisted like a ribbon through hills washed pale by moonlight. The grass along the edges bent low beneath the breath of a wind older than memory itself. The air had tasted of dust and time, and the faint tang of iron drifting from the stones, a smell that seemed to rise whenever the evening grew still enough for you to hear the soft hiss of the earth cooling. They had told you to come quietly, to follow the narrow trail where roots broke through the soil like knuckles of forgotten hands, and to bring no lamp, for the moon would be enough to lead you where you needed to go. You had carried only a cloak against the chill and the echo of footsteps behind you, people moving slowly as though the night itself had asked them to speak less, breathe softer, tread carefully upon its sleeping back. The quarry lay open like a wound in the hillside, its walls sheer and pale, the floor littered with broken fragments of rock glimmering faintly beneath the cautious silver of the stars. In one corner, half hidden by weeds and shadow, there had been a low opening, a place where earth had given way to emptiness, where stone had split to reveal a hollow, neither holy cave nor holy shelter. You remember stooping low to enter, your hand brushing rough walls still warm from the sun's long departure. The air inside cool and carrying the faint scent of water dripping slowly in the dark. The space was larger than you expected, its ceiling arching like the ribs of some sleeping giant, its floor worn smooth where countless feet had stood and knelt and waited through other nights like this one. They were already there, the others, faces turned toward the single lamp flickering at the center, its light folding itself across the stones like a shawl drawn close against the cold. No one spoke at first, for the place itself seemed to ask for silence, the kind not made of fear but of reverence, as though the darkness had grown used to listening more than speaking. The hymn began softly, one voice rising like the thin thread of smoke from a dying fire, carrying words you had heard before, yet never like this. Not wrapped in such tenderness that even the echoes leaned close to listen. Another voice joined, then another, until the air itself felt shaped by harmony, the stone walls turning the sound gentle, passing it back and forth until it returned softer each time, like water finding its way through sand. You remember standing near the edge, feeling the song move through you, the way wind moves through leaves, not stopping, not asking, only passing on something older than language, yet carrying the shape of hope itself. The melody never hurried, never rose sharply, only circled slowly, like birds gliding over fields at dusk, unafraid of falling, because the air itself seemed to hold them in its patient hands. Someone lit another lamp, setting it on a ledge where the flame pushed shadows upward, and for a moment the whole cave looked as though the stars themselves had bent low to hear the song better. You closed your eyes then, letting the hymn wash through the weariness you carried, through the noise of days filled with labor and dust and the smallness of survival, until all that remained was breath and sound and flickering light. The voices blended in ways no scribe could write and no empire could silence, carrying notes shaped not by perfection but by faith, the kind that trembles yet never truly breaks. You thought of how the song must travel upward through the opening, slipping into the night, above rising past trees and hills and watchful winds, until even the stars must wonder what longing carried such fragile courage toward them. Someone began to hum beneath the melody, a low, steady sound, like earth itself joining in, like soil and stone and root lending their quiet strength to the thin voices of those gathered here. You felt the roughness of the wall against your palm, the coolness of stone grounding you, even as the song seemed to lift everything higher than the cave, higher than the quarry, higher than the reach of fear. When the hymn finally faded, it did not end so much as soften until the last note seemed to fold itself into the dark. A small bird returning to its nest after flying through endless sky. No one moved for a while, as though stepping or speaking too soon might scatter what had settled gently across the room. Something too delicate to name, yet strong enough to hold back the weight of the world. A woman near the lamp began to pray, her words carrying the smell of olive oil and earth and rain-soaked fields, each sentence falling like water into the stillness, rippling softly outward until even the walls seemed to breathe. Others followed, voices rising and falling like slow wind through wheat, the prayers weaving together without haste, as though the night itself had promised there would be enough time for every longing to be spoken. You remember the warmth of shoulders touching as people drew closer, not from fear or cold alone, but from the quiet knowledge that togetherness held its own kind of shelter, one no storm could fully scatter. The lamps burned lower as the hours passed, their light bending gently toward the floor, shadows deepening in corners where perhaps even angels leaned back to rest a while before following the prayers upward again. Someone shared dates wrapped in leaves, the sweetness thick and grainy against your tongue, and water carried in clay jars, still cool from the well where it had been drawn before sunset. By the time you left, the quarry lay silent beneath a paling sky, the moon drifting westward like a tired traveler, the hills holding the first faint rumor of approaching dawn. You carried the hymn with you long after the cave had disappeared behind trees and distance, its melody threading through your thoughts like a lantern carried through corridors of sleep and memory. Even now, when night falls thick and voices grow few, you sometimes hear it again, not with your ears, but with something deeper, as though the stone itself had kept singing long after the people were gone. Perhaps the cave still waits in the hills, its walls remembering every note, every prayer, every flicker of lamplight that once turned darkness into a cathedral no empire could ever close. And perhaps the wind, moving slowly through grass and root and hollow places, still carries that hymn to ears willing to listen, folding the forgotten song into the heartbeats of those who have yet to sing it. You remember the way the road curved gently toward the sea, the horizon wearing its evening colors like a fading tapestry, each thread of gold and rose stitched softly against the widening blue of the approaching night. The air had grown cooler as you walked, tasting faintly of salt and cedar smoke, drifting from distant cottages where lamps already glimmered behind shutters, closed against the wind, climbing inland from the water's restless edge. Someone had told you there was a house at the end of the road where a lamp never went out, a flame kept burning through storm and silence alike, tended by hands older than anyone could clearly name. You had followed the path not because you doubted the story, but because something in the thought of such a light felt like warmth itself calling through the dusk, a promise whispered just beyond the reach of day. The house appeared almost suddenly, crouched low against the slope above the waves, its walls weathered by years of wind carrying sand and salt, and the sighs of tides that never kept their distance for long. You saw the lamp first, its glow slipping through the window's narrow mouth like honey poured slowly from a jar, thick and steady, the kind of light that refused to tremble even when the wind grew sharp outside. The door opened before you could knock, and an old man with shoulders wrapped in wool nodded as though he had been expecting you, his eyes carrying the calm of someone long accustomed to visitors arriving wordlessly at twilight. Inside, the air held the scent of beeswax and drying herbs, at thyme and rosemary hanging from the rafters, where they turned slowly whenever a draught slipped through the stone walls like a curious but harmless ghost. The lamp stood upon a table carved from driftwood, its base blackened from years of flame, the glass smudged by smoke that seemed less like a stain and more like the signature of nights already endured. He spoke little at first, moving slowly, each gesture careful, as though both lamp and silence required the same reverent attention, as though noise itself might startle something delicate flickering in the corners of the room. You remember the way he touched the lamp, not hurriedly, but with the care one might give to a sleeping child, turning the wick so the flame bent lower, then feeding it oil until it straightened again with quiet dignity. He told you then, in a voice roughened by years of salt, air, and prayer, how the lamp had burned through storms that tore at the roof, through nights when soldiers passed close enough for footsteps to shake the shutters. The flame, he said, was not only for light, but for memory, a thread of fire linking those who had gathered here long before your own steps found this road, those whose songs had filled the dark after doors were barred. You listened as he spoke of nights when believers came soaked from rain, their clothes clinging, cold and heavy, their faces drawn, but eyes bright as they warmed themselves beside the lamp before kneeling upon the stone floor to pray. He said the flame never failed them, that even when oil grew scarce and winds pressed hard against the walls, the light somehow lasted until dawn, as though defiance itself lived in the small, steady heart of its glow. You watched the lamp as he spoke, noticing how the glass caught the light and softened it, spreading a warmth that seemed too wide for so small a flame, too generous for such a humble vessel of brass and wick. Outside, waves struck the rocks below, sending up salt that the wind carried toward the house, yet the lamp burned on, unconcerned, as if the sea itself had no say in whether darkness would win this night. He showed you a small jar of oil, thick and golden as pressed sunlight, the smell faintly sweet like crushed olives warmed by long afternoons, and you thought how strange it was that such quiet things could hold back shadows. The old man smiled then, not at you exactly, but at something farther away. Perhaps at the memory of faces gathered around this same table years before, hands passing bread, voices rising softly as the lamp burned between them. He said some nights the believers came carrying scrolls wrapped carefully against the rain, words inked by trembling hands in secret rooms where the sound of a single knock might scatter letters before the page had time to dry. Other nights they brought nothing but themselves, weary from fields or from hiding, carrying only the hunger for prayer and the need for a place where silence was not emptiness, but sanctuary thick enough to rest inside. The lamp, he told you, had seen them all, the farmers with mud still clinging to their sandals, the widows with hair unbound by grief, the children falling asleep before the prayers had fully ended. You could feel the years in the way he spoke, each memory laid down like another layer of wax upon the candle of his life, until even his pauses seemed shaped by the weight of stories too long to finish telling. When you asked why the lamp still burned now, when soldiers no longer searched houses and prayers no longer needed to hide beneath the sea wind, he simply looked at the flame as though the question had already answered itself. Because light, he said softly, should never grow comfortable enough to forget darkness entirely. Because even peace carried shadows at its edges, waiting for the chance to lengthen when no one kept watch. You thought then of how many nights this single flame had outlived, how many storms and silences it had endured without complaint, how even the stars seemed less faithful, appearing and vanishing behind clouds as they pleased. The old man poured more oil, his hand steady, though the flame leaned briefly as though listening, and for a moment you felt as if the whole room bent with it, the walls, the air, even your own heartbeat. You stayed until the horizon paled and the first gray threads of dawn touched the water. the lamp still burning, though the sun itself would soon scatter every shadow for miles beyond the patient little house. When you finally left, the old man stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the wood, as though holding the house upright against centuries of wind, the other raised faintly in blessing without words. The road back carried the smell of rosemary and smoke upon your cloak, and in your mind the flame still burned, small yet steady, as though memory itself had borrowed its light to guide you through the widening day. Even now, years later, when you pass cottages where lamps glow against the dark, you find yourself wondering who tends them, whose hands keep such faith burning through nights when the wind grows restless again. And sometimes, when storms climb the hills and darkness gathers too quickly, you imagine that old house above the sea, its lamp still burning, the keeper still waiting, the flame still refusing to surrender its small, steady fire. You remember the way the morning light fell through the orchard, soft and warm as honey, touching the gnarled trunks of the trees whose roots curled beneath the soil like the fingers of ancestors, holding secrets of sun and rain. The air carried the scent of earth after a gentle rain, sweet and damp, mingled with the faint perfume of blooming jasmine and the metallic temps of the small fountain hidden behind the ivy-covered wall. Somewhere beneath the leaves, birds stirred softly, their wings brushing against branches in quiet acknowledgment of the day, while a distant brook whispered against smooth stones, shaping the sound of water into an invisible hymn that followed you like a shadow. You were led there by a woman whose hands smelled of lavender and parchment, who moved with the ease of someone used to walking slowly, carrying the weight of her own prayers while guiding others toward sanctuary. The garden was enclosed by walls of warm, sun-baked clay, where moss and lichen had gathered over years, softening the roughness of stone into a cradle that seemed to embrace anyone who stepped inside. Paths of worn flagstones meandered beneath fig and olive trees, their surfaces cool beneath your bare feet, carrying the faint residue of dew and the long memory of countless pilgrims who had knelt in these same quiet corners. She showed you a bench, simple yet smooth, from years of hands resting, and told you to sit while she moved to the fountain, tilting her palm so water spilled gently onto her skin, catching light that seemed almost sacred in its simplicity. Around you, the garden hummed with life, not loud or insistent but intimate, as though the very leaves leaned close to hear the prayers that would soon rise here, and the wind itself moved only in consideration of what might be said. You could feel the cool stone beneath your fingers, the rough texture grounding you while the warmth of sunlight brushed your face, a gentle reminder that even in hidden places the world continued its slow, patient turning. The woman began to speak softly, not to you exactly, but to the garden itself, reciting words learned in secret rooms, words that smelled faintly of ink, candle smoke, and the sweetness of bread shared after long days of toil. You listened as the prayers curved upward, passing through branches, over walls, past the distant hills, and you realized that even though no one else could see this small place, everything here was witnessed, remembered, and cherished. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of rosemary and the earthy fragrance of turned soil, and you felt as though the wind itself carried the prayers further, beyond the garden, beyond the city, toward ears willing to hear. The fountain splashed lightly, a rhythm steady and unhurried, like a heartbeat echoing the cadence of voices long silenced. A reminder that persistence is not loud but enduring, not sudden but faithful. Someone handed you a small loaf, warm and fragrant, the crust yielding easily under your fingers, and you realized the act of sharing food here was itself a form of prayer, a tactile offering alongside words lifted toward unseen heavens. The woman motioned for you to close your eyes, and you felt the sunlight shift, dappling through leaves and falling across your eyelids like a soft benediction. The sound of water blending with birdsong and distant wind into a chorus that held time in suspension. You remembered how each prayer, though whispered and private, seemed to gather strength in the air, joining countless others, until even the stones beneath you seemed to tremble with gentle acknowledgement of faith carried in silence. A child passed by on bare feet, carrying a small bundle of herbs and flowers, leaving a trail of scent that mingled with the fountain and the olive trees, a reminder that devotion need not be solemn to be sincere, and care need not be loud to matter. You felt the roughness of bark beneath your fingertips, the coolness of shaded stone beneath your knees, the sun's warmth on your shoulders, and realized that all of these textures were prayers too, carried in the touch of body against earth. When the woman finally fell silent, the garden did not feel empty. Instead, it seemed to breathe gently, holding the echo of every prayer, every shared loaf, every hand pressed to stone, every leaf brushed by wandering fingers in quiet devotion. You stood to leave, pausing at the gate where the sun had moved higher, casting long shadows behind the trees, the scent of jasmine lingering, a reminder that even when you walked away, the garden remained alive with memory. The wind carried the faintest trace of water and leaves as you returned to the road, and you realized that every step back into the city was guided by the unseen chorus of those who had knelt here before you, their faith like a soft tether keeping your heart steady. Even years later, when you passed other gardens, other quiet corners, the memory of this one returned, its stones and fountains and fragrant air teaching you that prayer does not need walls or witnesses, only hands willing to hold faith tenderly and without hurry. And sometimes, when night falls and the world grows still, you can imagine the garden waiting, leaves trembling softly, fountains singing, a single place where whispered prayers rise slowly toward the sky, remembered and kept alive by wind, earth, and enduring hearts. You remember climbing the narrow stairwell that twisted up into the attic, each step worn smooth by countless feet, carrying the scent of aged timber and dust that had gathered patiently, settling like soft whispers in the corners. The small window at the top framed a sliver of sky, pale as a silver ribbon at dawn, through which you could see rooftops pressed close together, tiles darkened by rain and time, and the faint curl of smoke from distant chimneys. The attic smelled of cedar and old paper, of earth pressed into the walls, and the lingering sweetness of incense once used to bless the house, a quiet perfume that seemed to settle on your skin as though welcoming you in. In the center of the room, atop a low wooden chest, lay a scroll wrapped carefully in cloth, its edges frayed and softened by handling, its surface carrying the faint imprint of fingers that had traced its words in countless nights long past. You reached out slowly, feeling the rough texture of the linen binding beneath your fingertips, the subtle warmth of the air rising from the chest as though the scroll itself had absorbed the breath of those who had kept it close. The room was still, save for the occasional creak of floorboards and the gentle sigh of wind moving through a crack in the roof. And in that silence, even your own heartbeat seemed to blend with the quiet rhythm of memory. You unrolled the scroll carefully, inhaling the faintly musty scent of ink and dried oil. And as your eyes fell upon the delicate script, it was as if each letter carried the whisper of a hand steady with devotion, tracing faith into existence. A candle flickered nearby, its light bending against the ceiling and walls, casting soft shadows that seemed to curve around the room, and for a moment, the attic became a vessel holding centuries of devotion in its narrow beams. You traced the words with your finger lightly, feeling the unevenness of ink upon parchment, and thought of those who had copied these prayers in secret, their hands shaking with both fear and reverence, yet determined to pass light through darkness. Some lines were faded almost to invisibility, yet you could feel the life they carried, as though the prayers themselves had absorbed the hands, the breath, the hope of everyone who had once knelt before them in hidden rooms. You heard the faint creak of the stairs behind you, though no one had come, and realized the sound only deepened the sense that this place, this small attic, remembered every arrival and departure, every careful handling, every whispered devotion. A breeze stirred the candle flame, carrying with it the scent of rain on tile from the window outside. And you imagined the scroll lifted gently by invisible hands, its words rising like smoke, joining prayers long since spoken but never forgotten. You thought of how many nights the faithful had gathered here, bodies pressed close in silence, eyes straining to read by faint lamplight, each letter on the page a small beacon in the vast unknown of the world outside. The cloth wrapping the scroll felt warm in your hands, infused with the memory of fingers that had held it before you. The scent of candle wax and parchment, of quiet nights and whispered songs, pressing softly against your skin. You leaned closer, listening to the soft rhythm of wind and candle and your own breath, and realized that the attic itself seemed alive with reverence. The floorboards, rafters, and beams, all witnesses to devotion too tender for public display. Someone had once placed a small vial of oil beside the chest, its contents dark and viscous, carrying the faintest smell of herbs and sunlight pressed into the liquid, and you imagined it used to anoint the pages, a subtle act of care spanning years. The words on the scroll were not just letters, but the echo of hope itself, fragile yet persistent, holding fast through centuries of silence, persecution, and the quiet fear that the world might forget their presence entirely. You closed the scroll gently, breathing in the mingled scents of cedar and ink, the subtle warmth of candlelight, and the echo of the hands that had carried it through storms, raids, and long nights of patient prayer. The attic seemed to sigh as you stepped back, the light bending gently around corners, holding the scroll in memory even when you no longer touched it, as if the air itself had absorbed the faith of those long gone. You descended the stairwell slowly, each step releasing dust motes that caught the candlelight in fleeting patterns, and felt as though you carried something beyond your own self, a trace of faith and fire pressed into your hands. Outside, the sky had paled toward morning, the first hints of light reflecting off tiles and water, and you realized the world beyond the attic continued on, unaware of the quiet miracles preserved in small, hidden rooms. Even now, when you pass an old house with attic windows, or the faint scent of cedar and old paper in the air, You remember that scroll, its words alive in silence. And the thought warms your chest like a small, steady flame against the cold. And sometimes, when night returns and the world grows still, you imagine the attic waiting, the scroll resting safely upon its chest, candle flickering, carrying the prayers of generations through time, through wind, through memory, preserved for anyone who chooses to listen. You remember the faint sound of dripping wax in a quiet room, the air heavy with the smell of honeyed tallow and the faint smoke of extinguished wicks, carrying the memory of nights where hands moved slowly over molds, shaping light before it was needed. The candlemaker's shop smelled of cedar shavings and soft dust, of herbs tucked between shelves, and the lingering sweetness of beeswax warmed gently over iron pots, as though the air itself had been steeped in devotion for generations. Outside, the sun fell low behind rooftops, brushing the windows with molten gold that pooled across the floorboards and glinted in small puddles of wax left by careful, patient hands, inviting you to follow light into shadowed corners. You watched the candlemaker bend over a table, his hands steady though gnarled with age, rolling wicks in the thick golden liquid, the heat brushing your fingertips like a whispered promise of warmth in the approaching evening. The molds were simple, yet each held the careful imprint of countless nights where light had been formed quietly, faithfully, in preparation for homes, altars, and hidden rooms where faith could be kept alive against the dark. He spoke softly, telling stories of believers who had come carrying fear and hunger, eyes wide with unspoken prayers, hands trembling as they lit the candles in secret spaces, letting flame become witness to hope that could not be named aloud. The air carried the faintest scent of lavender and rosemary, herbs tucked near jars of oil and small bundles of cloth, and you realized that every detail of the shop, every texture and smell, was a prayer made tangible through patient care. You watched wax drip and pool, each drop a tiny memory held in amber, the gentle rhythm of creation echoing the quiet pulse of the heart of faith. Slow but unwavering, a rhythm older than words and older than fear itself. The candlemaker told you of nights when soldiers passed close enough to hear the faint hum of prayer, and how the soft light of candles had guided trembling hands through darkness, providing not only illumination but the courage to continue believing. You noticed the way he handled each candle, pressing gently to remove bubbles, smoothing edges with the tenderness of one tending to something alive, and understood that light here was more than wax. It was memory, devotion, and quiet courage made visible. A faint breeze stirred the open window, carrying the scent of rain on cobblestones, mingling with the heavier fragrance of beeswax and herbs, and you felt the whole room hum softly, as though the shop itself breathed along with the pulse of faith within it. You remembered the way children had once gathered near the hearth, faces wide with wonder, learning to roll wicks and dip candles, their small hands brushing against warm wax, imprinting their own quiet hope into the material of devotion. Before they even knew the word, the candlemaker's voice softened further, recalling nights when believers had lit candles in the quiet of their rooms. Each flame, small yet resilient, a fragile yet unyielding companion against loneliness, fear, and the creeping cold of a world that often could not see their faith. You traced your fingers along the smooth surface of a finished candle, feeling the heat that lingered and the gentle texture that seemed to hold the memory of creation itself. and realized that each piece was a witness, a whisper, a steadfast heartbeat in wax and light. He spoke of times when a single candle had brightened an entire attic, a cellar, or a hidden chamber, its glow reaching eyes that had not seen kindness, hands that had not felt warmth, hearts that had been shadowed by doubt or loss. You felt the weight of such devotion in the quiet sweep of the shop, the lingering scent of wax and oil, the warmth of lamps already lit, and the knowledge that faith often traveled on the back of humble, careful labor rather than grand gestures or loud proclamations. The candlemaker dipped another wick, the wax thick and golden, the motion slow and rhythmic, each movement carrying the memory of those who had come before, the prayers that had been poured into flame, the lives illuminated quietly, far from the eyes of the world. You realized then how the smell of beeswax, the feel of warm molds, and the glow of tiny flames could hold more meaning than words. How patience, care, and faith were intertwined, creating light that endured long after voices had fallen silent. He placed the finished candles upon a shelf, each one standing upright, waiting, and you understood that they were more than objects. They were sentinels of memory, guardians of the small, private flames that had kept belief alive through fear and solitude. You left the shop at twilight, the scent of wax and herbs clinging to your cloak, and you could still feel the quiet pulse of devotion in your chest, carried out into the empty streets like a soft, enduring ember in the deepening dusk. Even now, when you pass a simple candle burning in a window or on a hearth, you remember the shop, the wax, the warm hands, and you feel again the gentle insistence of faith, resilient, patient, and luminous, holding steady in a world that often forgets to notice. And sometimes, when the night grows long and the wind carries the faint scent of rain and honeyed wax, you can imagine that small shop waiting, its candles ready, the candlemaker tending light as he has for decades, keeping the quiet fire alive for anyone willing to see. You remember stepping through the narrow doorway that led to the hidden chapel, the stone cool beneath your hands, the air thick with the scent of incense and aged wood, carrying the memory of countless quiet evenings spent in reverent stillness. The walls were low and darkened by time, yet soft candlelight flickered against carved beams, illuminating shelves of worn texts and vessels long polished by hands that moved with gentle purpose, as though even the shadows were considered sacred here. Outside, the wind pressed against the roof, carrying faint echoes of bells from distant towers. But inside the chapel, every sound was softened, absorbed by rugs and tapestries that held the warmth and whispers of generations. You noticed the lingering scent of frankincense and myrrh, the subtle sweetness mingling with the earthy aroma of stone and soot, as though the chapel itself had inhaled devotion through the ages and exhaled it back as quiet comfort. A single priest knelt near the altar, robes brushing the floor in soft folds, hands folded over an open text, eyes lowered. And you felt that the room's stillness had been holding its breath for his arrival alone. He looked up slowly, not startled, but acknowledging your presence as if he had been expecting it. And the faint light from nearby candles touched his face, revealing lines softened by years of prayer and careful watchfulness. The pews, though simple, carried the imprint of generations of knees pressed to wood, their quiet creak still present under the weight of memory, as if the very fibers remembered devotion even when no living soul occupied them. you walked toward the altar, each step muffled by thick rugs, feeling the temperature shift slightly, cooler and calmer, carrying the sense of deep, contained history, like breathing in a place where centuries had paused in reverence. He spoke softly of nights when worshippers came in hiding, bringing nothing but whispered words and small lanterns, gathering here in secret, and how the chapel had held their prayers like a sponge holds water, absorbing each one without complaint. You traced your fingers along the smooth stone of the altar rail, feeling the subtle warmth of countless palms, each touch leaving a faint echo of hope, and realized that even the simplest gestures of devotion were preserved in the quiet of this room. The priest lifted a small censer, swinging it slowly, and the smoke curled around beams and walls in soft spirals, carrying scents that seemed almost tangible, rising and spreading like gentle waves across a sea of stillness and memory. You watched the dance of light and smoke, noticing how the flame's reflection flickered against the gold leaf of tiny icons, and felt a quiet wonder at how these small, careful acts of faith had endured through shadow and uncertainty. He whispered a prayer, his voice low but clear, the words weaving through the air like threads of silk, and you felt the chapel itself responding, walls vibrating ever so slightly with the accumulated devotion of those who had knelt here before. You sat quietly, the warmth of candlelight brushing your cheeks, the subtle scent of herbs and wax mingling with dust and stones, and felt time stretch, holding you in a space where every heartbeat seemed to echo both past and present. Outside, the wind pressed harder, rattling shutters and carrying distant voices, but inside the chapel, the sound became part of the room's pulse, softened and gentle, as though even the elements knew they were guests in this place of quiet reverence. He spoke of hope preserved in small actions, of letters smuggled in by hands that trembled but refused to falter, and of prayers spoken when the world outside seemed too harsh, all of them finding shelter here in the chapel's patient heart. You could feel the subtle heat of candle wax in your hands when you lifted a small taper, the light bending and trembling as though alive, and realized that each flame here was more than illumination. It was memory, witness, and quiet defiance against darkness. The scent of smoke and oil, mingled with the faint sweetness of pressed flowers tucked between texts, carried through the air like a gentle hymn, leaving an imprint on your skin and in your chest, a soft warmth that lingered long after the words had faded. You remembered the careful steps of those who had built this sanctuary in secret, the patience it required to create a space where faith could live openly even when the world refused to notice, and how their labor was a prayer made manifest in stone and light. When you finally left, the priest's quiet blessing lingered in the air, the candles flickering gently behind you, and you felt as though the chapel had exhaled, releasing centuries of devotion into your own heart to carry forward into the world outside. Even now, when you pass old stone buildings or faint traces of incense, you recall the hidden chapel, the warmth of candles, the soft echo of whispered prayers, and the quiet insistence that faith, like light, finds a way to endure when nurtured tenderly and patiently. And sometimes, when night presses close and the air is still, you can imagine that chapel waiting, walls breathing with memory, candles standing ready, a small but steadfast place where the prayers of the faithful continue to rise, untouched by time or fear. You remember the hollow echo of the bell in the old tower, its sound rolling softly across cobblestone streets and over quiet rooftops, carrying with it a faint scent of iron rain-soaked wood and time itself, resonating through memory like a gentle heartbeat. The winding staircase to the belfry felt cool beneath your hands, stone worn smooth by centuries of careful climbs, and the air smelled faintly of moss, smoke, and the lingering warmth of sunlight pressed into the walls long after the day had passed. You peered through the narrow openings, seeing the village below bathed in the soft glow of dusk, smoke rising from chimneys, and lanterns flickering in windows, each one a tiny witness to lives shaped by hope, fear, and quiet devotion. The bell's rope was coarse under your fingers, the fibers warm from constant use, and as you traced it slowly, you imagined the hands of those who had pulled it in celebration, in mourning, or in silent prayer for those who could not speak. The sound of the bell was not harsh but resonant, vibrating through your chest and filling the tower with a gentle insistence, as if calling not only to those below but also to memory itself, stirring echoes of faith long kept in quiet hearts. You noticed the scent of old metal and dust, mingled with the faint sweetness of beeswax from nearby candles left by worshippers, and felt the atmosphere thicken with reverence, the very air holding the weight of countless prayers offered beneath this vigilant tower. The bell had rung for weddings, births, and quiet evenings of gratitude, each toll a small marker of life, and you realized that even in its solitude, it carried a community's devotion, holding their hopes suspended in sound that stretched like a bridge across time. You ran your hand along the cold metal, feeling tiny imperfections smoothed by age, and understood that faith often travels in ordinary vessels, shaped by care and repetition, holding light and meaning in forms simple enough to endure centuries. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves in a soft rhythm, and the bell's echo carried through them, mingling with the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of wildflowers, as if nature itself had absorbed and remembered the tolling of devotion across years. You imagined villagers ascending the tower silently, lanterns in hand, pressing fingers to the rope in secret, offering prayers for loved ones, safety, or strength, and realized the bell had borne witness to both joy and sorrow, a sentinel for hearts both hidden and exposed. The soft light of the setting sun caught on the metal, glinting like a memory pressed into time, and you felt a quiet warmth as though the bell itself were aware of the hands, voices, and hearts it had touched, keeping faith alive in echoes of sound. You thought of nights when the bell had rung quietly, unnoticed by those passing in the darkness, carrying prayers meant only for the heavens, the sound wrapping the village in a gentle reassurance that devotion persists even when unseen. The air was cool and thick with the smell of rain-soaked stone, the tower holding it in long, gentle drifts that brushed your skin, and you felt the weight of centuries in the small, sacred spaces of life and ritual that the bell had quietly overseen. You traced the rope once more, feeling the gentle give of fibers that had been pulled thousands of times, each tug a heartbeat, a prayer, a promise, and understood that the simplest acts can carry the deepest meaning when repeated with care and attention. The bell's echo lingered in your chest, a soft vibration that seemed to merge with your own heartbeat, and you realized that memory, like sound, travels in waves, moving through space and time, leaving traces of hope and faith wherever it touches. You leaned against the cool stone, listening to the distant murmur of the river, the soft sigh of the wind, and the faint rustle of leaves, and felt that the bell had been more than an instrument, it had been a guardian, preserving devotion in resonance. You noticed the faint scent of candles, incense, and damp moss mingling in the tower, and imagined the countless hands that had climbed these stairs, each carrying intentions, fears, and love, leaving subtle imprints in the stone and wood for future travelers to sense. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching across the village, and the bell seemed to absorb the dimming light, glowing softly in the remaining warmth, a small reminder that even in darkness, the work of faith continues quietly and steadily. You pulled gently on the rope once, feeling the familiar resistance and listening to the soft, lingering vibration, and understood that even a single toll could carry centuries of hope. A reminder that faith endures when nurtured with patience and tenderness. The tower air smelled faintly of rain and iron, carrying the quiet insistence of memory and devotion. And you felt as though you could leave it behind, but still carry the echo within you. A small, enduring warmth that would follow you wherever you walked. Even now, when you hear a bell toll at dusk, or catch the faint scent of wet stone and iron, you remember the tower, the rope, the candlelight, and the subtle pulse of faith vibrating in your chest, a quiet companion through the night. And sometimes, when the wind moves gently through the trees and the sky darkens to twilight, you can imagine the bell waiting in its tower, ready to carry the prayers of the faithful, whispering them softly to the heavens in an endless, patient rhythm. You remember stepping into the hidden garden at dawn, the air thick with the scent of dewladen earth and blooming jasmine, each breath carrying the quiet memory of hands that had tended these plants in secret, shaping a sanctuary of soft green devotion. The stones beneath your feet were cool and damp, pressed into the soil over years, and the faint sound of a trickling fountain mingled with the distant coo of doves, creating a lullaby that seemed older than the village itself. You noticed the delicate rustle of leaves, stirred by a gentle breeze, carrying the subtle sweetness of herbs and flowers, as if the garden itself breathed in the prayers whispered by those who had knelt here with hands folded and hearts trembling. A narrow path led past beds of lavender and rosemary, their fragrance mingling with the faint aroma of wet stone, and you felt the soft warmth of sunlight brushing your shoulders, painting gold upon petals that had seen centuries of quiet devotion. The garden walls were ivy-clad and cool to the touch, holding the memory of countless fingers pressed into stones, tracing prayers into surfaces that would endure long after those voices had fallen silent in the world beyond. You watched a small bird flit between branches, its wings catching morning light, and it reminded you that even the smallest movements can carry significance as faith travels in gentle gestures, hidden and patient, shaping life unseen yet profoundly. The fountain murmured its ceaseless song, the water cool and clear, carrying reflections of leaves and sky, and you realized that devotion often flows like this, small and steady, carving paths in the hearts of those who nurture it, quietly yet insistently. You ran your fingers along the wooden bench near the fountain, feeling the faint warmth of the sun mixed with the lingering coolness of morning dew, and understood that even objects, touched by generations, carry the resonance of care and intent. The air smelled faintly of honey and beeswax, a remnant from tiny lanterns left by worshippers to light the path for early risers. and you felt the soft insistence of presence, of people who had chosen patience, reflection, and humble devotion over recognition. You noticed the subtle imprint of small hands pressed into soil. Flowers slightly bent from care, herbs clipped with precision, and it occurred to you that the garden itself was a living record, a testament to those who offered prayer in action rather than words alone. The sun rose higher, warming stone and soil, and the soft fragrance of rose petals and lavender mingled with the earthy scent of damp soil, creating a symphony of aromas that seemed to hold both memory and hope within its gentle embrace. You traced the edges of flower beds, noticing faint carvings in stones marking names long forgotten, each one a quiet witness to life, devotion, and prayer. And you felt a connection to those who had walked these paths, their intent lingering in the air like a soft hum. A faint breeze brought the subtle rustle of hidden wind chimes, their delicate sound merging with the fountain and bird calls. And you felt that faith often travels in small harmonies, moments unnoticed by the world, yet powerful enough to shape the quiet heart of a place. You knelt briefly by a patch of rosemary, brushing your fingers over the leaves and inhaling their scent, and realized that even this simple act of attention, of presence, carried the weight of centuries of devotion preserved in the smallest, most delicate forms. The garden seemed to breathe with the rhythm of unseen hands tending soil, the warmth of sun, and the cool shadows under arches of climbing ivy. And you understood that faith can be cultivated silently, like this garden, without fanfare, yet endlessly enduring. You noticed small lanterns along the paths, flickering as morning light caught on glass and metal, and you imagined the soft glow they had offered in dark hours, carrying hope to wanderers and seekers whose steps would otherwise falter in shadow. The fragrance of herbs and flowers mingled with the soft scent of rain from the previous night, and you felt the tactile texture of leaves and petals, the gentle roughness of stone walls, and the smooth flow of water in the fountain, all holding memory in physical form. You remembered the gentle hands that had planted roses and lavender, tended vines, clipped herbs, and poured water into fountains, each act a silent prayer, a gesture of hope, a quiet insistence that life, faith, and love endure even when unseen. You rose slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun, the soft weight of dew on your fingertips, and the subtle echo of centuries of devotion in the air, realizing that the garden held more than flowers. It held patience, memory, and the quiet persistence of belief. Even now, when you pass a small garden, smell herbs in bloom, or hear the faint trickle of water over stones, you remember this hidden sanctuary and the soft, enduring presence of faith woven into the earth, the air, and the rhythm of daily life. And sometimes, when the day grows long and the wind carries the scent of flowers and damp soil, you can imagine that garden waiting, its lanterns softly flickering, its fountains murmuring, a quiet place where devotion continues to breathe through every leaf, stone, and petal. You remember entering the quiet chamber where the eternal flame burned, its warmth brushing softly against your skin, carrying the subtle scent of melted wax and aged stone, and you felt as if time itself had paused to let you breathe in its steady light. The walls glowed faintly, kissed by the amber shimmer of the flame, revealing the rough texture of stone and mortar, each imperfection holding memory, each shadow whispering stories of hands that had built this sanctuary and hearts that had kept faith alive here. You traced the edge of the hearth, feeling the smooth heat of metal and the cool roughness of stone, and understood that the flame was more than illumination. It was memory, devotion, and quiet defiance, persisting through centuries of silence and shadow. The air smelled faintly of smoke, honeyed wax, and the faint tanks of iron. A complex perfume that wrapped around you and reminded you that faith is never only visible. It lingers in scent, touch, and warmth long after the moments pass. You knelt beside the flame, feeling its soft heat on your palms, and noticed how it danced and bent, moving like a living thing, yet steady and resolute, carrying within its small body the weight of countless prayers whispered into the dark. Beyond the chamber, you could hear the faint echo of the village waking, the distant murmur of footsteps and birds, yet the flame held its own world, a universe in miniature where devotion remained untouched by the passage of ordinary hours. The shadows flickered against carved walls, the outlines of symbols and icons softened by the movement of light, and you felt a gentle, persistent reassurance that faith endures, shaped not by spectacle, but by quiet constancy and tender attention to what is sacred. You noticed the scent of incense that lingered from previous offerings, delicate and sweet, mingling with the warmth of wax and stone, and realized that the chamber itself had absorbed devotion, preserving it in its air walls and surfaces as a subtle, enduring presence. The flame's reflection shimmered in small vessels and polished metals, doubling its light in quiet, deliberate ways, and you understood that faith multiplies when held gently, reflected back in acts of care, remembrance, and patience, no matter how small or unseen. You ran your fingers along the hearth's edge, feeling subtle vibrations from the flame, as if it were breathing softly in rhythm with your own heartbeat, and felt an intimate connection to those who had come before, sharing the same quiet warmth and stillness. The warmth pressed gently into your palms, mingling with the cool stone beneath, and you realized that devotion is tactile as well as spiritual, existing in the feel of surfaces, the weight of time, and the soft heat of a light tended faithfully through years. You remembered the countless candles that had preceded this one, each flame lit by trembling hands in secret or in community, and understood that each small act of care accumulates, building a lineage of light that defies darkness without fanfare or spectacle. The chamber seemed to breathe, carrying the subtle sigh of centuries, the faint movement of air through cracks in stone, and you felt that this flame was not merely fire, but a living memory, a steady pulse connecting all who had knelt here in quiet worship. You observed the faint streaks of soot along the ceiling and walls, noting how the flame had marked its presence over time, a reminder that even persistent devotion leaves traces, small scars of love and care that quietly testify to endurance and constancy. The air smelled faintly sweet, smoky, and earthy, wrapping around your senses like a soft cloak, and you understood that the flame held both comfort and solemnity, a gentle insistence that belief survives even when voices are hushed and hands tremble. You felt the heat of the fire warming your face, noticed the subtle dance of shadows, and realized that this chamber, these stones, and this flame carried the same stories you had traced through rivers, gardens, and bell towers, the arc of quiet faith preserved in physical and spiritual form. The flame bent in the gentle draught, yet did not falter, and you felt a deep, settled reassurance that faith is patient, resilient, and enduring, capable of surviving in hidden spaces, whispered prayers, and moments unseen by the wider world. You pressed your hand briefly against the stone near the hearth, feeling the residual warmth and texture, and thought of all the hands that had built, tended, and prayed here, leaving traces in touch, memory, and light that linger far beyond the passing of years. The scent of melted wax, faint smoke, and stone combined with the soft hum of warmth to create a sanctuary of sensation, a place where devotion was tangible, where the past and present merged in gentle rhythm, and where you could feel the pulse of generations. You watched the flame bending toward you, small and intimate, and realized that its light is the echo of all who had tended it before, a continuum of care, hope, and quiet insistence that life, faith, and love persist even in obscurity. The chamber seemed endless, its warmth and glow extending beyond the walls, and you felt that the flame had become a compass, pointing not toward a destination, but toward patience, constancy, and the enduring quiet of belief held tenderly through centuries. Even now, when you see a small flame in a window, smell faint wax or incense, or feel warmth pressed against your palms, you remember this chamber, the eternal flame, and the subtle truth that devotion survives in quiet persistence, echoing through the spaces we inhabit. And sometimes, when the night is still and the air smells faintly of smoke, honey, and stone, you can imagine that flame flickering endlessly, a sentinel of hope and memory, carrying the prayers of the faithful softly into eternity, and feel its warmth settle into your heart.